Ladies and gentlemen, today we take a deep dive into the extraordinary and dangerous life of Henry Hill, a man who lived the gangster dream before becoming one of the most famous informants in American history. Henry Hill was born on June 11, 1943, in Brooklyn, New York, to an Irish father and a Sicilian mother. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he was surrounded by the influence of organized crime from an early age. His family lived near a cab stand that was a front for Paul Vario, a powerful captain in the Lucchese crime family. From the moment he saw the flashy cars, expensive suits, and the power that mobsters commanded, young Henry became mesmerized by the life of crime. As a teenager, Hill was eager to escape the mundane struggles of his lower-middle-class upbringing, and the Mafia seemed to offer an alternative filled with respect, wealth, and adventure. Unlike many of his schoolmates, who dreamed of becoming doctors or lawyers, Henry admired the gangsters who walked his neighborhood like kings. At the age of 11, he started running small errands for the men at the cab stand, fetching coffee and delivering messages. Though these tasks were minor, they gave him a sense of belonging in a world that valued loyalty and toughness above all else. By the time he was a teenager, Henry had stopped paying attention to school altogether. He was drawn more and more to the men who never seemed to work a regular job, yet had access to luxuries most people could only dream of. He became an errand boy for the Lucchese crime family, doing whatever was asked of him. In return, he received small amounts of cash, free meals, and the admiration of his peers. More importantly, he gained the attention of Paul Vario, a feared and respected figure in the New York underworld, who took a liking to the ambitious young boy. Hill quickly learned that the Mafia thrived on a strict code of silence and respect. He idolized men like Jimmy Burke, a ruthless gangster known for his intelligence and brutality, and Tommy DeSimone, a violent enforcer with a short temper. These men were larger-than-life figures in his world, and Henry saw them as role models. They treated him like a younger brother, teaching him the unspoken rules of organized crime. Never talk to the police. Always show respect to your superiors, and above all, never be weak. Despite his young age, Hill was already seeing the darker side of the criminal world. He witnessed brutal beatings and violent acts, but rather than being scared, he became more determined to prove himself. He was taught how to commit small-scale scams, from stealing trucks full of merchandise to running illegal gambling operations. Every successful job boosted his confidence and earned him a greater role in the family's operations. Henry Hill wasn't born into wealth or power, but through his early exposure to the Mafia, he found a way to climb the social ladder in the only way he knew how, through crime. His introduction to the underworld at such a young age set the stage for a life of deception, danger, and ultimately, betrayal. As Henry Hill moved from his teenage years into adulthood, his involvement with the Lucchese crime family deepened. No longer just an errand boy, he began taking on more serious responsibilities within the organization. Under the mentorship of powerful figures like Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke, Hill learned the intricacies of organized crime, including loan sharking, extortion, smuggling, and illegal gambling. He was eager to prove his loyalty and competence, and the more tasks he completed successfully, the more trust he earned from his superiors. One of the first real money-making schemes he participated in was an airport theft operation. Hill and his associates would bribe airport workers at JFK International Airport to provide inside information on shipments of cash, jewelry, and expensive merchandise. With this knowledge, they could hijack valuable cargo without leaving a trace. These operations were highly lucrative and solidified Hill's reputation as a reliable earner within the Lucchese family. He quickly learned that in the Mafia, making money was the key to survival and status. By the late 1960s, Henry Hill had firmly established himself as an associate of the Lucchese crime family. However, due to his Irish heritage, his father was Irish and his mother was Sicilian, he could never become a fully made man in the Mafia. Italian crime families had strict rules about induction, allowing only those of full Italian descent to be officially initiated. While this meant that Hill would always be an outsider in some ways, it did not prevent him from gaining influence and power within the organization. He worked closely with high-ranking mobsters and was treated as a valued member of the crew. One of Hill's biggest money-making operations was running a sophisticated gambling and loan sharking ring. He and his associates would lend money to desperate individuals at outrageously high interest rates. If a debtor failed to pay on time, Hill and his crew would use violent intimidation tactics to ensure repayment. This type of business was extremely profitable and gave him a steady stream of cash, further strengthening his status within the underworld. Hill also became deeply involved in sports fixing, most notably the Boston College point-shaving scandal of the late 1970s. This scheme involved bribing college basketball players to deliberately manipulate the final score of games so that the Mafia could win large bets. It was a highly risky operation that involved bribery, deception, and corruption at the highest levels of collegiate sports. Despite the dangers, it was another example of Hill's ability to exploit opportunities for financial gain, further increasing his reputation among criminals. During this period, Hill also indulged in the luxuries of the Mafia lifestyle. He had access to the finest restaurants, drove expensive cars, wore tailor-made suits, and lived a life that most people could only dream of. He spent his nights at exclusive clubs, where he socialized with celebrities, politicians, and other high-profile figures. His connections and influence extended beyond the criminal world, allowing him to operate with a sense of invincibility. However, with power and wealth came increasing risks. As his involvement in criminal activities grew, so did the likelihood of law enforcement scrutiny. The FBI and local police had already started monitoring the Lucchese crime family closely, and Hill was aware that any misstep could lead to his downfall. But in the world of organized crime, once you're in, there's no easy way out. One of the most infamous crimes Henry Hill was associated with was the Lufthansa heist, which took place on December 11, 1978, at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. This heist became one of the largest cash robberies in U.S. history at the time, with an estimated $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry stolen, equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. The mastermind behind this daring operation was Jimmy Burke, one of Hill's closest associates and a high-ranking member of the Lucchese crime family. The idea for the heist came from an inside tip provided by a cargo worker named Louis Werner, who had a severe gambling addiction and owed a large sum of money to the mob. Werner revealed that vast amounts of untraceable cash from international flights were regularly stored in the Lufthansa terminal at JFK Airport. Since these shipments came from overseas, they were largely unaccounted for by U.S. banks, making them an ideal target for a high-stakes robbery. Planning the heist, Hill was not directly involved in the execution of the robbery itself, but he played a significant role in coordinating logistics and ensuring the right people were involved. Jimmy Burke carefully selected a team of skilled criminals to carry out the job, including Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, Louis Cafra, and other experienced thieves. They meticulously planned every detail, from the layout of the airport to the security procedures, and even identified the best time to strike. The plan was simple but extremely dangerous. The robbers, dressed as airport workers, would enter the terminal in the early morning hours, overpower the security guards, and load the cash and jewelry onto a getaway vehicle. The key to the operation was controlling the airport staff without triggering an alarm or alerting law enforcement. The execution of the robbery. In the early hours of December 11, 1978, the heist unfolded exactly as planned. The armed men stormed the Lufthansa cargo terminal, held employees at gunpoint, and forced them to open the vault where the cash was stored. Within minutes, they had loaded the stolen money and jewels into a waiting van and disappeared into the night. It was a flawless execution, and remarkably, the heist was completed without firing a single shot. The sheer amount of money stolen shocked the authorities and the public. The FBI immediately launched an investigation, knowing that such a well-coordinated robbery could only have been orchestrated by the Mafia. However, without immediate leads or physical evidence, they struggled to find any solid connections between the crime and known criminal figures. The aftermath, a trail of murders. While the heist was initially seen as a massive success, the aftermath turned into a bloodbath. Jimmy Burke, paranoid about loose ends and potential informants, ordered the execution of nearly everyone involved in the robbery. One by one, the men who had participated in the heist began disappearing. Some were shot in the head, others were found frozen in car trunks, and some were never seen again. The mass killings ensured that no one would turn on Burke, but it also sent a clear message to the authorities that this was a mafia operation. Henry Hill, although not a direct participant in the robbery, witnessed the fallout firsthand. He understood that in the world of organized crime, even the biggest victories could turn deadly. The Lufthansa heist may have been one of the most profitable robberies in history, but for those involved, it was also one of the most dangerous. Despite the brutal aftermath, the case remained largely unsolved for years. Although many suspected Burke and the Lucchese family were behind it, law enforcement struggled to gather enough evidence to make arrests. Eventually, it would be Henry Hill's decision to turn informant that would provide critical insights into the crime, but even then, many details of the Lufthansa heist remained shrouded in mystery. By the late 1970s, Henry Hill's life was spiraling out of control. He had become deeply involved in drug trafficking, despite the fact that the Lucchese crime family had strict rules against selling narcotics. Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario, Hill's longtime mentors, had always warned him about the dangers of dealing drugs, not just because of law enforcement, but also because it brought too much attention to their criminal operations. However, Hill was addicted to both the money and the drugs themselves, particularly cocaine, which only made him more reckless. Despite the Mafia's disapproval, Hill began running his own drug smuggling operation, moving large quantities of cocaine and heroin across the country. He partnered with associates in Pittsburgh and other cities, creating a profitable but highly risky enterprise. His lavish spending and increasingly erratic behavior drew suspicion not only from law enforcement, but also from his own Mafia associates, who started seeing him as a liability. The FBI closes in. By 1980, Hill's drug business had become too big to ignore, and the FBI had gathered enough evidence to move in on him. On April 27, 1980, federal agents arrested him in connection with drug trafficking. The arrest was a turning point in his life. He was now facing serious federal charges, which meant a long prison sentence if convicted. More than that, he knew that his involvement in drugs would not sit well with the Lucchese family. In the Mafia world, dealing drugs was one of the quickest ways to get yourself killed. Although many mobsters secretly profited from narcotics, officially, the major crime families forbade it because it brought too much heat from the authorities. If Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke found out that Hill had not only been selling drugs, but also operating outside their control, he knew they would see him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The realization that his life was in danger. Sitting in jail, Hill had time to think. He knew that even if he managed to get out on bail, he would never be safe. The Lucchese family had already begun killing anyone they suspected of cooperating with law enforcement, just like they had done after the Lufthansa heist. Hill had been close to both Burke and Vario for years, but he also understood the brutal reality of the Mafia. Loyalty only lasted as long as you were useful. The moment his bosses suspected that he might talk to the authorities, he would become a target. Hill had seen it happen before. He knew that if he went back to the streets, a hit could come at any time, whether it was a bullet in the head, a car bomb, or being strangled in a basement. Even his wife, Karen, was terrified. She had overheard conversations that made it clear they were being watched, and she knew that if Henry didn't make a decision soon, their entire family could be wiped out. The FBI's offer, testify or die. Federal agents were well aware of Hill's situation. They knew he was in a no-win scenario. Either he went to prison for decades, or he risked being murdered by his own former allies. That's when they made him an offer. Turn informant and testify against the Lucchese crime family in exchange for protection. At first, Hill hesitated. Snitching went against everything he had been taught in the Mafia. The code of omerta, the vow of silence, was sacred, and breaking it meant you were as good as dead. But deep down, Hill knew he had no choice. If he didn't take the deal, he would either rot in prison or be killed. The pressure was immense. He had spent his whole life looking up to men like Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke, but now those same men were planning his execution. He had heard whispers that Burke was already making arrangements to have him taken care of before he could testify. The realization hit him hard. He had spent decades proving his loyalty to the Mafia, but in the end, loyalty meant nothing when you became a liability. As he sat in his jail cell, Henry Hill faced the most important decision of his life. Would he stay silent and accept his fate, or would he betray the very organization that had given him everything? After his arrest in 1980, Henry Hill faced the most difficult decision of his life, whether to betray the very crime family that had raised him or risk being murdered for knowing too much. The FBI made it clear that he had no way out. The Lucchese crime family, particularly his longtime mentors Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario, had already started planning his assassination. The only way to survive was to turn informant and enter the Witness Protection Program, WITSEC. At first, Hill struggled with the idea of cooperating with the government. For decades, he had lived by the Mafia code of silence, or omerta, which forbade members and associates from talking to law enforcement under any circumstances. Snitches were considered the lowest of the low in the criminal underworld, and turning on his former associates meant becoming a marked man for life. However, Hill understood that he had no choice. If he refused the deal, the best-case scenario was spending the rest of his life in prison. The worst-case scenario was a brutal execution at the hands of the very men he had once called his friends. In May 1980, Hill agreed to become a government witness. He, along with his wife Karen and their 2 children, was immediately placed under FBI protection. His cooperation was a massive victory for law enforcement, as Hill was not just any small-time criminal. He had been deeply embedded in the Lucchese crime family's inner circle for years. His testimony had the potential to bring down some of the most powerful figures in the New York underworld. Testifying against Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke, one of Hill's first major contributions as a witness was providing detailed testimony against his former bosses, Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke. He revealed key information about their operations, including details about loan sharking, illegal gambling, extortion, and the infamous Lufthansa heist of 1978. Although Burke and Vario had been careful never to directly implicate themselves in crimes, Hill had been present for many of their conversations and could provide first-hand accounts of their criminal dealings. Hill's testimony played a crucial role in the prosecution of both men. Paul Vario, a powerful capo in the Lucchese family, was convicted of racketeering and extortion and sentenced to 12 years in prison. He died behind bars in 1988. Jimmy Burke, the mastermind behind the Lufthansa heist, was convicted of murder and conspiracy based on Hill's testimony and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He never saw freedom again and died in 1996. These convictions were monumental for law enforcement. The Mafia had long operated with near-total impunity, as witnesses were either too afraid to testify or ended up dead before they could take the stand. Hill's cooperation changed that, proving that even the most feared mobsters were not untouchable. Life in witness protection. After his testimony, Henry Hill and his family were placed in the Witness Protection Program, which meant relocating under new identities. The government moved them to various locations across the United States, often to small towns where no one would recognize them. He was given a new name, fake documents, and a fresh start, on paper at least. However, adjusting to life as a normal citizen proved to be incredibly difficult for Hill. For decades, he had lived as a high-rolling gangster, with unlimited cash, access to luxury, and connections everywhere. In witness protection, he was just another nobody, struggling to find work and stay under the radar. His wife, Karen, also hated the new life, and their marriage began to crumble under the pressure. Adding to the problem was Hill's drug addiction and reckless behavior. Despite the FBI's efforts to keep him hidden, he couldn't let go of his old habits. He started using and selling drugs again, drawing unwanted attention to himself. On multiple occasions, he violated the rules of witness protection, contacting former associates, or revealing his location through careless mistakes. Federal agents were frustrated with Hill's inability to stay out of trouble. Despite giving him a second chance at life, he kept falling back into his old ways. The final straw came in the early 1990s when he was arrested again for drug-related charges. The FBI finally decided that Hill was too much of a liability and expelled him from witness protection. From that point on, he was on his own, without the Mafia's protection and without the government's help. After being expelled from the witness protection program in the early 1990s due to his repeated arrests and inability to stay out of trouble, Henry Hill found himself in an extremely dangerous position. He was a marked man, with the Lucchese crime family still wanting him dead for betraying them. At the same time, the FBI had washed their hands of him, no longer willing to provide him protection due to his reckless behavior. Without law enforcement or Mafia connections to shield him, Hill was forced to navigate life on his own, living under constant paranoia that a hitman could come for him at any moment. Despite the risks, Hill struggled to adjust to a normal, crime-free life. For decades, he had lived in the fast lane, surrounded by wealth, power, and an endless supply of drugs and alcohol. The transition to a regular, law-abiding existence was almost impossible for him. He had no formal education or job skills, and his criminal reputation made it difficult to find steady work. Even though he had escaped the Mafia lifestyle physically, mentally, he was still a gangster, unable to let go of the habits that had defined him for so long. Battles with addiction and the law. One of Hill's biggest struggles in his post-Mafia life was his long-standing addiction to drugs and alcohol. He had begun using cocaine heavily in the late 1970s while he was still working for the Lucchese family, and his substance abuse only worsened after he left witness protection. He drank excessively, used drugs frequently, and often got into trouble with the law because of his behavior. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Hill was arrested multiple times on drug possession, public intoxication, and other minor offenses. Despite his fame, he could never fully escape his self-destructive tendencies. He attempted multiple times to get clean, even checking into rehab facilities, but his addiction was a lifelong battle that he never truly won. His chaotic lifestyle also affected his relationships. His marriage to Karen Hill completely fell apart, leading to divorce. Karen had stood by him during his time in the Mafia and witness protection, but after years of dealing with his substance abuse, infidelity, and reckless decisions, she finally left him. This was a major blow to Hill, as Karen had been one of the few stable forces in his life, turning his story into a business. Despite his struggles, Hill found a way to capitalize on his criminal past. In 1986, journalist Nicholas Pileggi published a book titled Wise Guy, which was based on Hill's life and experiences in the Mafia. The book became a bestseller and caught the attention of Hollywood director Martin Scorsese, who turned it into the legendary 1990 film Goodfellas. The film, starring Ray Liotta as Henry Hill, Robert De Niro as Jimmy Burke, and Joe Pesci as Tommy DeSimone, became an instant classic and is now considered one of the greatest gangster films ever made. The release of Goodfellas made Henry Hill a household name, bringing him fame and notoriety. He was no longer just another former gangster. He was now a celebrity criminal, sought after for interviews, book deals, and television appearances. He frequently appeared on talk shows, documentaries, and crime-related programs, giving first-hand accounts of his time in the Mafia and his experiences in witness protection. Hill even attempted to turn his Mafia past into a legitimate business, launching a line of pasta sauces branded under his name and publishing multiple books about his life, including Gangsters and Goodfellas and the Wise Guy Cookbook. He embraced his pop culture status, often joking about his past, despite the fact that it had nearly cost him his life. However, no amount of money or fame could erase the damage he had done to himself over the years. While he enjoyed the attention that came with Goodfellas, he still battled drug addiction, legal issues, and personal demons. Henry Hill's final years were a mix of fading notoriety, health issues, and personal struggles. Despite the fame he gained from Goodfellas and his multiple book deals, his life was still far from stable. Years of substance abuse, legal troubles, and reckless behavior had taken a severe toll on his health and relationships. Even though he was no longer in the Mafia, Hill remained paranoid for the rest of his life, always looking over his shoulder. The Lucchese crime family never officially called off the hit on him, which meant that, in theory, he was still a marked man until the day he died. Although the Mafia's power had declined by the early 2000s and younger mobsters barely knew who he was, Hill continued to live with the fear that someone, somewhere, might still want him dead. Final years of struggle. As he aged, Hill's health began to deteriorate due to decades of alcohol and drug abuse. He suffered from heart disease, diabetes, and other medical conditions, which only worsened with time. Even in his 60s, he struggled with addiction and was arrested multiple times for drunk driving and drug possession. His inability to stay clean frustrated those around him, as it seemed he would never fully escape the lifestyle that had consumed him for so many years. Despite his legal troubles, he remained in the public eye. He continued to make media appearances, discussing his past life in organized crime. He was frequently featured on true crime documentaries, podcasts, and talk shows, offering first-hand insights into the Mafia world. In some ways, he enjoyed his celebrity status, relishing the attention that came with being a former gangster-turned-informant. In his later years, he also became more reflective about his choices. While he had no regrets about leaving the Mafia, he often spoke about the guilt he carried for the things he had done. He acknowledged the violence, betrayals, and pain he had caused, not just to others, but also to himself and his family. He expressed remorse for dragging his wife and children into a life of crime and danger, knowing that they suffered because of his decisions. Pop culture legacy. One of the most significant aspects of Henry Hill's legacy is how deeply his life story influenced pop culture. While he was a real-life gangster, his experiences became the basis for one of the greatest crime films of all time, Goodfellas. Ray Liotta's portrayal of Hill in the movie made him an iconic figure in Mafia history, immortalizing his story for future generations. Beyond the movie, Hill's memoirs and interviews provided valuable first-hand accounts of how the Mafia operated. His storytelling helped shape public understanding of organized crime, offering an inside look at the corruption, violence, and rules of the underworld. Unlike other mobsters who stayed silent or downplayed their past, Hill openly discussed the brutality and paranoia that came with being part of the Mafia. Even though he was no longer a part of the criminal world, Hill remained a controversial figure. Some people admired his willingness to speak out against the Mafia, while others viewed him as a traitor and criminal who got away with too much. His life was a constant tug-of-war between his past and present, as he struggled to balance his former identity as a gangster with his new reality as a public figure. Henry Hill's life was a roller coaster of crime, wealth, fear, and ultimately, survival. From his early days as a rising star in the Lucchese crime family to his dramatic downfall and decision to turn informant, his story remains one of the most fascinating in Mafia history. Despite escaping the mob's deadly grip, he could never fully outrun his past. His struggles with addiction, law enforcement, and personal demons followed him until his final days. Yet, despite all the chaos, Hill's story serves as a cautionary tale. It reveals the illusion of power in the criminal world, where loyalty is fleeting and even the most trusted associates can become disposable. His life was both glamorous and tragic, filled with moments of excess but also deep regret. When Henry Hill passed away in 2012 at the age of 69, he left behind a complex legacy, one that continues to captivate audiences through books, movies, and documentaries. His experiences gave the world a rare glimpse into the inner workings of the Mafia, exposing the dangers and betrayals that came with it. Though he lived to tell his story, the price he paid was a life of constant fear,